Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and while we did not have a race this weekend, we do have a lot to talk about. One of the biggest talking points this week has been whether or not Max Verstappen may receive a race ban. And if he does, what would happen next? I've received a ton of questions about this point, about what penalty points are, how they work, and what the system really is, and also what would happen next if this does happen. Another question I received a lot was whether or not this is pretty common. If this is something that's happened before, if this is very rare, if it's easy to receive a race ban, or if it means something very serious. So because of all of that, and because this is a conversation that will be relevant for a couple of weeks, this week we're going to use the episode to actually be a little bit more educational and break down what penalty points are, how Max got into this situation, what it looks like if he does get a race ban, and of course, if this is really common, and a little bit of a history about what penalty points are and why they work the way that they do. In this, we'll also talk a little bit about the FIA, what the governing body of Formula One is and how it works, and a little bit about the drivers that have previously received a race ban, so that we can talk about whether or not this is actually a very common thing or if Max is just a special case. Hopefully by the end of this episode, you will understand a little bit more about what's going on and be able to form your own opinions about whether or not you think Max will end up with a race ban, and if so, who you think should fill that seat. So let's go ahead and dive into this conversation. The first thing that you need to understand about this system and about what's going on is what the FIA really is. They govern a number of motorsport series, including F1, but also including feeder series like F2, F3, and F4, as well as other motorsports series like Formula E, a World Rally Championship, and the World Endurance Championship. So the FIA actually stands for the International Automobile Federation, and the organization that is important for Formula One is the sporting division underneath the FIA. The FIA was founded in Paris in 1904, and they started overseeing motorsports in 1922. So the important thing to understand is that Formula One and the FIA are actually two separate entities. The FIA is an international governing body that oversees multiple motorsports series, and Formula One is the actual series itself. That is why sometimes you see a clash between the FIA and Formula One itself, because they are two separate entities with two separate goals. So all that being said, the FIA is the body that decides when people are eligible to drive Formula One in the form of super licenses, as well as things like penalties and penalty points. But the current penalty point system that we have is actually relatively new. The system that we currently operate under was actually established in 2014. And the way the penalty point system works is actually pretty simple. If a driver amasses 12 penalty points within a 12-month period, they receive a one-race suspension, meaning that whatever race they receive that 12th penalty point within a 12-month period, the following race they are not allowed to race their car. Under this penalty point system, only a single driver has ever had a race ban, and that was actually last year, Kevin Magnussen. Now, one thing that is important to note is that penalty points have a 12-month expiration on them, so penalty points don't fall off at the end of the season. You don't get a clean slate when the next season starts. You have one full calendar year before that penalty point that you earned actually falls off of your super license. And the intention behind that is that if we didn't have a penalty point system that was 12 months long, and you knew that you had 12 points to give every season, you certainly could start racing in a more dangerous manner if you got to the end of the season, 4 races left, and you haven't scored any penalty points yet. The 12-month system, in theory, should keep you on your best behavior because anything that you do will affect more than a single season of your racing. But that also means that as you get close to a race ban, in theory, your points should start to fall off of your license. If you're new to the world of Formula One, but you watch other sports, a great thing to compare this to would be sort of like fouling out in basketball or getting a red card in soccer or football, depending on where you are. All of these different systems penalize you for unsportsmanlike behavior. So to compare this to basketball, think about the idea of fouling out. In an NBA game, a player can commit 5 fouls without having a problem. There are obviously in-game penalties that would cause this to be a bad idea, but you can stay in the game as long as you've only committed 5 fouls or less. The second you commit a 6th foul, you foul out of the game, which means that you can no longer play this game and you have to go home. However, at the next game, that foul number resets. You don't have to worry about the fact that last game you committed 4 fouls and this game you only have 2 fouls to give, otherwise you're going to get out of the game. So fouls in the NBA reset each game. However, the NBA may decide, okay, you have been fouling out every single game, you're getting ejected every single game, and your behavior is dangerous. And so they could issue a game suspension or a multi-game suspension. So in theory, with the FIA, it's very similar. In Formula One, if you receive 12 penalty points across the board in a 12-month period, you got to sit out for one race. That 12-month period should keep you on your best behavior, but if it doesn't, you will miss a race. So one of the main questions people have been asking is how hard is it to actually get a race ban, and is it a very common thing? Since the penalty point system was implemented in 2014, only a single driver has received a race ban, and that was Kevin Magnussen last year in 2024. The thing that's kind of surprising about Kevin Magnussen's race ban is that he earned all 12 points in a single season. All 12 of those points that earned him a race ban were earned across the single season of 2024. And if you're wondering what type of incidents can actually earn new penalty points. Let's run through those incidents that caused Kevin Magnussen to receive a race ban. First, in Saudi Arabia, he caused a collision with Alex Albon, which earned him 3 points. Then in China, he earned another 2 penalty points for causing a collision with Yuki Tsunoda. And then in Miami, he earned a crazy number of points because he earned points in both the sprint and the Grand Prix. He received 3 penalty points for leaving the track multiple times while racing with Lewis Hamilton in the sprint, and he received 2 penalty points in the Grand Prix itself for causing a collision with Logan Sargent. And the incident that actually earned him that race ban, giving him the final 2 points needed, came at the Italian Grand Prix when he earned 2 points for colliding with Pierre Gasly. So after Monza, he was at that 12-point penalty count and did receive a single race ban for the following Grand Prix. So one of the questions I did receive a couple of times is what happens when a driver does receive a race ban? The questions were mostly about what the team does. And the answer to that is that the team is allowed to put their reserve driver in that car and still compete with the second car. So the team is still able to earn points. And with Haas last year, Ollie Behrman stepped in and took that seat and ran that race. So while the team is still able to run both cars and the team itself is not penalized, the driver is not able to compete, meaning they can't earn points. And it's truly a penalty for that driver. So you may have noticed a couple of things as I was going through Kevin's points. And that is that the penalty points are not always identical for the same infraction. With Kevin Magnussen, for example, we saw him earn a differing number of penalty points depending on the type of collision and the intensity. So he earned 3 points for causing a collision with Alex Albon in Saudi Arabia, but only earned 2 points for causing a collision with Yuki Tsunoda in China and 2 points for causing a collision with Logan Sargent in Miami. Penalty points can be awarded by the FIA for a number of infractions, anything from safety car infringements to causing a collision to leaving the track multiple times, overtaking under a red flag, driving too slow in the pit lane. There are a number of different things that you can receive penalty points for. And the number of those points that you would receive is up to the discretion of the FIA based on the intensity of the infraction. So that's why you'll see a little bit of variation in those points, why certain drivers may receive less for certain infractions, and why you might even see 2 drivers in the same incident receive a different number of penalty points. It really is on a case-by-case basis and dependent on the situation itself. So in terms of the idea of how hard is it to earn these penalty points, how frequently are we seeing people get banned, Kevin Magnussen is the only person since 2014 to receive a race ban. But what was going on before we implemented this penalty point system? Kevin Magnussen was not the only driver to ever receive a race ban. Prior to the penalty point system, race bans were handed out by the FIA based off of certain specific infractions. This was instead of a penalty point system that allowed you to kind of see where you were at for the season and behave accordingly, a punishment that could be dished out for specific infractions. Again, to use a basketball analogy, you could think about this like being ejected from a game because you received 2 technical fouls. A race ban could be handed out by the FIA for a single infraction depending on what it was in an attempt to dissuade that type of behavior moving forward. So race bans prior to this point system were really something that were handed out at the discretion of the FIA as a form of punishment for a specific infraction. It also meant that you couldn't really game the system in the same way. You couldn't stop behaving in a certain way until your penalty points fell off, but you could also see that a race ban was handed down based off of a single infraction rather than a history of reckless driving. So let's talk about a couple of those race bans from history. The most recent race ban prior to that 2024 race ban for Kevin Magnussen was actually Romain Grosjean in 2012. Romain actually received a race ban for a single race incident. At the time, he was racing for a team called Lotus, and another driver you may be familiar with, Lewis Hamilton, was driving for McLaren. In the Belgian Grand Prix that year, we saw in the very opening lap, Romain move in a way that forced Lewis Hamilton off track. He was forced into the grass, and directly after that, the 2 cars collided very severely. That collision actually picked up another 3 cars as they continued to roll. 2 Saubers as well as Fernando Alonso were taken into that collision, and all 5 cars were severely damaged. That incident was then ruled to be Romain's fault, and he received a single race ban for the following race due to the fact that he had quote-unquote eliminated leading championship contenders from the race and was an extremely serious breach of the regulations. Because of that single incident, he actually received a race ban for the following race, and Lotus had to put their reserve driver into the car. Now, we also saw a number of other drivers who are actually world champions actually receive race bans. Jacques Villeneuve received a race ban in 1997, and that race ban really jeopardized his chances of winning a championship. Heading into the race where the incident took place, he was only 1 point away from overtaking Michael Schumacher in the championship standings. And his race ban actually came during the same weekend as the race he was banned for. And that's because he, along with 5 other drivers, received a suspended race ban for not slowing under a yellow flag. This incident actually took place during a practice session, but Jacques Villeneuve had actually already done this same infraction 3 times prior, and therefore his race ban was not suspended and was actually brought up to the next available race, which happened to be Suzuka the following day. Therefore, he received a race ban for failing to slow under a yellow flag during a practice session, which you can see could feel a little bit more intense than it seems like it should. And actually, the team that he was driving for at the time, Williams, felt that this was not a fair punishment for the actual infraction, and they appealed the FIA's decision and the race ban. Because there wasn't time for there to actually be a hearing held, Villeneuve was allowed to actually participate in the Suzuka Grand Prix. However, later they overturned the appeal, and because of that, his participation in the Suzuka Grand Prix was cancelled, and the 2 points that he had earned towards the championship that race were removed from his point standings for the season. Because of that, it also means that for that race, it was essentially like Williams only had one car participating, and they were not able to receive any championship points from the Villeneuve car. So I actually think these 2 different instances, the Romain incident and this Jacques Villeneuve incident, give you an idea as to why we may have needed a penalty point system. If you look at these 2 incidents and you look at how they played out, one involved a very big crash that was pretty bad, which ended in an automatic race ban for a single driver after an incident that obviously ended his race for that race. And the other incident that we've looked at, the 1997 situation with Jacques Villeneuve, required there to be some sort of due process for the driver to be able to appeal that decision, but that appeal ultimately ended with a worse situation where the team was not able to make decisions based off of the fact that ultimately he would have received the race ban. So this point system that we have now kind of eliminates those types of situations. Obviously, someone could receive 12 penalty points if they wanted for the incident like Romain had, and that decision could be appealed by the driver and their team, but what would be more likely is that that driver, Romain, would have received a large amount of points towards his overall point standing, which would hopefully result in him driving in a more safe manner for the rest of the season. For the Jacques situation, obviously he would have just received penalty points towards a race ban, and he would have been able to continue fighting for that World Drivers' Championship, but perhaps doing so in a more safe manner and heeding the warnings of something like a yellow flag, especially given that that one in particular meant that other drivers had actually committed the same offense, but did not receive a punishment as harsh. And again, we've also seen other drivers receive race bans in the past before this penalty point system. Drivers like Michael Schumacher, who's a 7-time world champion. The idea of driving in a way that receives penalties or receives a race ban is not something that is uncommon, but it is something that obviously has a little bit more of a system to it now than we did in the more kind of classic era of Formula One. And we've also seen that as we have this system, we start to see a little bit of a change in the way that these drivers are driving and the way that these drivers adjust their driving style when they know they are close to a race ban. So that gives us a little bit of a history as to how we got to this new system, how many drivers have had bans in this new system, and what the last race ban looked like. And let's talk about how Max got to the point that he is teetering on a race ban. After last week in Barcelona, Max has a total of 11 penalty points, meaning that he is 1 point away from a race ban. But a number of those penalty points that he's dealing with were actually earned back in 2024 last season. He has 2 points that are set to fall off of his super license on June 30th, and those were earned in last year's Austrian Grand Prix. Max received 2 penalty points for causing a collision with Lando Norris, and this was in the heat of this idea of Max potentially losing a driver's championship to Lando. This happened on lap 64 of the Grand Prix, and this was after Max had been driving defensively against Lando, overtaking him for a long period of time. Lando tried to make a move to the outside line of Max. Max moved in a way that pushed him into the curb, and that collision ultimately forced Lando to retire. Max went on to finish that race and only earned 2 penalty points for the incident. The next 2 points were earned in October of 2024 at the Mexico City race. This was again an incident with Lando Norris where Max was deemed to have forced Lando off the track. There was no contact, but Max did receive 2 penalty points for this incident. He earned another penalty point in the Brazilian Grand Prix last year on November 2nd, and that was for accelerating under a virtual safety car, accelerating too soon before the car was actually ended. He was found to be 0.63 seconds under the minimum delta when the actual green light conditions came underway. He earned another point at the end of November on the 30th, and that was at the Qatar Grand Prix. This was for driving unnecessarily slowly in qualifying, and this was an incident that happened with George Russell. That was sort of the beginning of the battle that we saw between the two of them, where Max was stripped of his pole position, George complained to the stewards, and Max was awarded a single penalty point. That was a hot topic of discussion last year. If you go back to the Qatar Grand Prix recap, you can hear a little bit more of that. And then he earned another 2 points at the end of last season in the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. That was due to an incident with Oscar Piastri. And then the 3 penalty points that were earned last weekend on June 1st. And then we have the final 3 points that were just earned last weekend at the Spanish Grand Prix. And that was because Max essentially intentionally accelerated into George and hit him. We talked in depth about what that was, what that looked like, and why it was actually such a big deal last week. But the highlights being that Max very much was in a moment of frustration. And this was a pretty serious incident where he intentionally drove into another driver. And we saw that become a very big issue, especially when the FIA put out their decision, pointing out that Max actually would not have received a penalty for overtaking off track, as his team seemed to think that he would have, and which caused the series of incidents that ended with him driving into George intentionally. So that kind of runs through how Max got himself into this situation. In terms of what happens after this, if Max does receive another penalty point between now and when his penalty points start to fall off on June 30th, he will receive a single race ban. When he does, Red Bull can can put another driver in that seat and still compete, but Max himself cannot compete, which obviously affects his ability to compete for a World Drivers' Championship, as that's an entire race where he earns 0 points. That being said, who goes into that seat, we don't know. There has been conversation about Liam Lawson or Isaac Hadjar, which also potentially means another driver would have to fill their seat at V-Carb for that race. All of those things are pretty stressful, but also not relevant if Max drives clean for the remaining couple of races between now and June 30th. The question will be, can he do so? Can he keep himself from earning another penalty point just between now and June 30th? And if he doesn't, how does that affect his ability to continue competing for a championship? And how does that affect Red Bull's ability to compete for a Constructors' Championship? So that pretty much wraps everything up. That's how penalty points work. That's where Max stands. And hopefully we see everything kind of be irrelevant. Hopefully he's able to race clean until June 30th and nothing really matters as these points start to fall off. If he does receive a race ban, his points would then reset. So he would have a new fresh 12 months and a fresh 12 penalty points he could earn after serving that single race ban. So how likely is it that Max actually receives a race ban? The most important thing to understand is that 2 of Max's 11 current penalty points fall off on June 30th. That means that Max really only has to get through 2 more race weekends before he has some of his penalty points start to fall off. Those 2 penalty points are the ones that were earned last year at the Austrian Grand Prix for colliding with Norris, and they will fall off directly after this year's Austrian Grand Prix. So Max needs to have a very clean weekend in Canada next weekend, and he also needs to have a clean weekend in Austria at the end of this month. If he can manage to do that, that means that 2 of those penalty points would fall off, bringing his current total back down to 9. That gives him a 3-point period of sort of wiggle room before he would receive a race ban. Currently, he is 1 point away. Now, 3 points may not sound like a lot given how many different times we've talked about 3 points being awarded for a single incident. However, before this incident in Barcelona, Max was 3 points away from a race ban, and it wasn't really a big talking point. But that's because it would really take a large incident for him to receive 3 points. And even in an incident like this, where there was a conversation about him potentially intentionally hitting a driver, he only received 2 points for that situation, as well as a 10-second time penalty, which obviously dropped him down in the final classification for the race down to 10th position, knocking him all the way down to only receiving a single championship point for this race. So if Max does make it all the way through those 2 race weekends and has that 3-point berth, he is in a much more comfortable situation in order to be able to race. However, after those 2 penalty points drop off at the end of this month, the next points are not set to expire until the end of October. Those 2 points would actually expire on October 27th of this year, and that actually takes us all the way through Mexico City this year. So even if Max does make it through these next 2 race weekends and does not have any penalty points acquired, and he has those 2 penalty points fall off, he will be working with a 3 penalty point berth from a potential race ban. And that 3-point spread would be the case for 9 race weekends. Now, to be fair, those 9 race weekends are the same spread that he actually managed to go through without earning more penalty points last season. But the question I've seen asked a lot was the 2 penalty points as well as the 10-second time penalty harsh enough? It is difficult for us to say why the FIA makes certain choices, but I do think that part of the reason why this was a 2 penalty point situation was the fact that both drivers did complete the race. Neither of the drivers were harmed, and obviously this is a situation where someone could have been hurt, but because there was not a crash, because neither of the drivers were unable to complete the race, and because George Russell and everyone else made it across the finish line in one piece, there is something to be said for the fact that this incident did not cause any irreparable damage. And to that point, that's very different than a situation like what we talked about before the penalty point system existed with Romain Grosjean. In 2012, when Romain caused that crash, he took out a total of 5 cars that race, including himself. In doing so, he affected the championship standings, which is part of why he was awarded a full race ban. Awarding Max any more than 2 penalty points at this race in Barcelona would have resulted in an automatic race ban for the following Grand Prix. And I think if we're speculating, the conversation would have had something to go across the lines of, was this bad enough to warrant an automatic race ban? Or was this a situation where we needed to kind of put him in a position where he needs to race cleaner? Max is someone who is known for a very aggressive racing style. He does a lot of wheel-to-wheel racing, and he does get himself into situations where we see that drivers are not necessarily coming out completely safely. This was absolutely, I think, a very heightened version of that. Max was very heated in the moment when this all happened, and I think to some degree the FIA sort of rubbed salt in the wound when they actually put out that document. We talked about this last week in the race recap, but one of the things that was kind of surprising about the document itself from the FIA was that they speculated on whether or not Max would have actually received a penalty for leaving the track. If you don't remember completely, the actual incident that we're talking about that gave him those 2 penalty points was a situation where, after a safety car restart, Max found himself on hard tires. From radio, we know that he did not realize he was going to be on hard tires and was not happy with the choice, but we also know that because of the strategy that he was on and the strategy that he had been for the full weekend, at that safety car restart, he did not have any other tire options, and so the team did put him on hard tires that were fresh, given that all of his competitors were also going on fresh tires. tires. Whether or not this is the right strategy move doesn't really matter here. What does matter is that in the safety car restart, while he was on that disadvantaged hard tire that was not warmed up, Charles Leclerc was very easily able to overtake him. And in attempting to not lose another position to George Russell, Max did leave the track in order to keep that position. However, the place where he did leave the track was actually legal, and it was not a situation where he would have been penalized for gaining an advantage by leaving the track. However, in the heat of the moment, we heard Max's engineer tell him that he needed to hand the position back, given that in that situation, they believed he would have been penalized for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, which means that he would have had to have handed that position back or received a time penalty. In that scenario where Max was getting upset and arguing with his engineer and his team, we saw him slow down, which Mercedes and George Russell took to mean that he was slowing down to allow him to pass and to take that position back. Then we saw Max rapidly speed up and hit George Russell's car. In that, again, nobody was hurt and everybody still finished the race. However, the situation could have been much different, and that's why we see the FIA document come out and hand out that penalty and award those 2 penalty points. However, the weird part of that document is that in a sassy parenthetical, we see the FIA say that Max actually would not have been penalized for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. And I think this is the part where it makes things sort of like a big what if, because ultimately the whole situation that we're talking about right now, going through all of these penalty points, talking about whether or not Max would have a ban, all come down to the fact that a bad strategy call was made and that the team made an honest mistake in believing that Max would be penalized for something he wouldn't have. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that Max's response to that situation then did put himself and other drivers in harm's potential way. And so those 2 penalty points maybe weren't harsh enough, but it does seem like we essentially saw the FIA look at it and say this was not enough to warrant an instant race ban, but it is enough to put you on the edge of one. It is a warning to drive a little bit safer and to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing. I do understand the arguments where people have said that he should have been black flagged, and that means that he would have been removed from the race itself, and that this situation really feels like it was more intense than a simple 2 penalty point situation and a 10-second time penalty. It's difficult too because a lot of the conversation after involves a lot of this inner drama between the 2 drivers. We see a lot of kind of sassy comments that are reinvigorating from one of Max's incidents last season, where actually this was something we talked about when we saw Max receive that 1 penalty point and we saw George and Max get into it and their drama sort of start to arise. One of the reasons why it seemed like Max was so upset about the situation and was so upset about the way that George spoke about him was the fact that he was awarded a penalty point, which again does affect the season. And so it's kind of interesting to look back at that and look at something that we were talking about before and say that, like, you know, it looks like part of why Max is so upset about this situation that happened last year, where George reports him for impeding when it was not intentional and says that it was a very, very, very dangerous situation, and then talks about how Max spoke about him in the steward's room. All of that creates this narrative, and underlying one of the biggest issues was the penalty point, because Max didn't just have his pole position deleted, he received 1 penalty point that will be with him for a full 12 months. And that penalty point is coming into play right now. And so it's interesting when we talk about these penalty points, this 12-month situation, and we talk about the fact that, ironically, George is the person that is causing these 2 penalty point situations, and the fact that that can heighten Max's issue with it. I think also when we're talking about drivers that are racing against each other every single week, which is something that's very different than any other kind of team sport. Like basketball, they're not playing the same team every week, they're playing other people. Rivalries exist, but you don't have to deal with that same person every single time you get on the court. Same thing with football, soccer, the NFL, any of those sports. Most team sports are not playing the same opponent every single week. And so when you look at something like Formula One or other motorsports as well, you're seeing drivers compete against the exact same drivers every single time they get on the actual circuit. And that means that these rivalries are every single week that you can needle at someone, and that you can have little situations that seem like they're not that big of a deal right now, but do become really big deals months later. And so I think looking back at George and Max's original incident they had last year that caused this big rift that was a big news story for a while, you're seeing the result of that argument, of Max losing that argument, actually come into play all these months later. Because that penalty point, which was awarded for driving unnecessarily slowly in qualifying, does not fall off of Max's super license until November 30th of this year. And so it becomes a point that is relevant. It is an issue that was relevant to Max's issue with George last year. It also means that a lot of that's getting inflamed again. It means that a lot of the response from both sides has to do with a situation that already happened in November of last year, and that we're bringing that rivalry back up. And it means that we get some wild sound bites that people talk about, like George saying, think about the children, and Max saying that he'll bring his tissues next week. I do think we'll get this energy of the rivalry coming back into play. And I also do wonder what the situation will look like if Max ultimately does get a race ban. If if he does find himself on the wrong side of it, 3 of those penalty points come down to an incident with George Russell across 2 different incidents. The question really becomes, how does Max respond to this? Does Max race the way that he always does and find himself with a race ban after Canada? Or does Max race really clean and manage to kind of keep himself out of the danger zone until these penalty points start actively falling off of his license? And which one's better for him strategically? Does he have to race very clean for the rest of the season because of how many kind of danger zones he'll find himself in throughout the year? And if that is the case, does he essentially kind of get it out of the way and move on with his life after this race weekend and 1 race ban? Or does Max really manage himself and make sure that he does not find himself in a race ban situation? And if Max does get a race ban, what does that look like for the future of Red Bull? Because that would result in a situation where for 1 race, you have someone stepping up into that lead Red Bull seat and driving against Yuki Tsunoda. Does that look like one of our V-Carb drivers stepping up? Does that look like Liam Lawson coming back and actually racing head-to-head with Yuki Tsunoda? Does that look like Isaac Hadjar, who has been a very promising young rookie, stepping into the Red Bull seat for a single race? Or do we see a completely different driver step into that seat? And with all of those possibilities, what does that look like for next year's lineup? Because we know that Yuki Tsunoda's contract would be up at the end of this year, and we know that Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson are both new to the team. And so there's a question of what their contracts look like, how locked in everybody is. Does Yuki prove himself in a way that they want to keep him in the Red Bull family past the Honda relationship? Is there other opportunities for them across the board? Or is there another young rookie that would step into one of those seats that really proves himself in a way that we aren't expecting? Max being off the board for 1 race would open all of these questions and all of the possible answers to them. And so it could be an interesting situation where, as frustrating as it would be to see Max get himself into a situation where he did receive a race ban, we would be able to see a little bit more about the future of Red Bull as a whole. We've seen many people say that they don't want to see Isaac in that seat because they feel like it has caused the downfall of a number of careers. And I think that that is a fair assessment. As much as I like Isaac and want to see him perform and do well, I also feel like he's performing and doing well exactly where he is, and leave him alone. There are so many possibilities that come out of this situation. But the ultimate hope, I think, for me, is that Max manages to race clean and does not see himself in that situation. That we don't see him make any emotional mistakes on track and endanger anyone, and that we see him manage to get through these next 2 race weekends, have 2 penalty points fall off, and this sort of becomes a non-issue. Do I think that that's what's going to happen? I don't know. Do I think that the George and Max narrative of it all is going to at least be a situation for a couple of weeks? Absolutely. And do I think that we're going to get a lot of sound bites from both of them that people put on t-shirts and throw them on Etsy? Yeah, I actually do. I'm curious to see which ones those are, and I'm excited to see it, honestly. Across the board, hopefully this episode has helped you understand the situation a little bit better. Hopefully you understand how penalty points work, why we say that technically only 1 driver has been banned under this system, and where the system comes from, how it works, and whether or not you think it's a better system than we had before. Personally, I do think that this allows for a kind of season-wide look at situations and allows drivers to kind of adjust, teams to prepare, and to give them sort of a due process situation as opposed to some of the problems that the old system caused. But I'm curious what you guys think. As we've gone through this, do you feel like the penalty point system makes sense? Do you feel like Max was not punished harshly enough for the situation? Do you think he'll be able to race clean for 2 more weekends and kind of get through this season without a race ban? And if he does receive a race ban, who do you want to see in that seat for a week? A couple of other talking points that you'll see about this race before we head into Canada include whether or not Lance Stroll will be well enough to drive, and if he isn't, who will be replacing him. And also, we're starting to see some of the silly season talk. We've seen Valtteri Bottas say that he was looking at a Red Bull seat and has presented himself to Cadillac and is looking for a seat next year. We've seen conversations about whether or not George Russell will be renewing with Mercedes, given that he has not officially announced an extension yet and does seem to be talking to other teams, as any driver without a contract should be doing. And of course, the conversation surrounding all of Red Bull and what those seats look like next year. And so I think we're finally starting to get into those rumor talks where silly season starts to percolate. All of that means that we're headed to Montreal and that we're going to see some fun racing. We're going to see an F1 Academy race weekend where we will also see them make up the race that they lost in Miami because of weather conditions. And hopefully across the board, we're going to see some clean racing and hopefully personally a return to form for Williams, because last weekend was pretty tough to watch in person. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode, and wherever you're listening, you are subscribed. If that's on a podcast feed, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you are subscribed wherever that is so that you're not missing anything. And I would love to know your thoughts on this race ban situation, the penalty point system, if you have any other questions. And the way that you can do all of that is if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, you can always leave your questions in the comments or, of course, your opinions on this week. And if you're listening to this somewhere other than YouTube, you can, of course, always go find this episode on YouTube and drop your comments, or you can always find me on social media. My username is @MarissaKamari, and you can always find me on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And you can also find me on Threads, actually. That's also where I open it up for questions and comments and hot takes after a race recap, and I always include those at the end of race recap episodes. And of course, you can always join our Discord server. We use that Discord server to kind of watch the races together, have fun talks and chats. It's a really fun place to be if you typically are watching Formula One all on your own, and you can make new friends and like-minded individuals that just want to watch the race in a non-judgmental way and have a good time. It's also a great place that you can ask questions if you like and be alerted when there are new episodes out. If you'd like to join the Discord server, follow me on any of those channels or anything like that, you can find the links to all of those things in the episode description down below. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully we've cleared up some of your questions about the race ban situation, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the Canada race recap.